The first thing I think really importantly, and we've talked a bit about today, is the actual context in which we were looking. This is the Pearl River Delta metropolitan region, one of the dense or most dense regions in the world, and fortunately I've been working a bit in this area, and the ambition of this district is pretty incredible. They're looking to compete with the San Francisco Bays in terms of the growth. They're looking at technology, and really they're looking at collaboration across all these cities and how can they collectively be a real powerhouse. This is the third biggest GDP as a region in the world. It's third only to the USA and Germany. So hugely influential in terms of where the region's going. But I'm going to take you back 218 BC. This is the very beginning foundations of Guangzhou, and it was the very beginning of the Silk Road. So this is where the growth of really China came from. 1,000-year business city, that was what it was referred to. It was a kind of conduit of trade and growth. It was also a landscape city because of its river and because of its mountain ranges. It was seen as a hugely valuable place to live and a successful city for those reasons. Modernisation happened in the kind of 1920s and 30s. That was through looking at reprofiling the river, basically allowing more growth to happen. In that period, it also coincided with the Great Leap Forward of the Communist China. This is when Mao took essential control of the kind of governing rule of China and looked at shifting the kind of economic focus from agriculture to industry. So you saw steelworks, you saw mining, you saw the whole kind of population all contribute and work together to create the very foundations of the cities and the country that we see today. When Mao eventually, unfortunately, died, or maybe some people say fortunately, it depends on which side of the spectrum you were looking at, he was radical in terms of how he shifted the kind of focus of a country and made them all work together. But he equally made it quite closed. And I think one of the big radical changes was in the 1970s. When he did die, they had a complete shift in mindset and they looked at openness and reform. They wanted to kind of open out to the world and be embracing the kind of growth and opportunities worldwide. So they looked at modernisation. They looked at kind of influence through Western design. You saw more Western designers get inside to China's kind of design system and look at widening the roads, creating better streets, looking at the opportunities of better infrastructure. Trade was again global as well, so this kind of asset of being along the Pearl River Delta again started to kind of work for it from a global perspective. And just to flick back, just from a perspective of growth, this was a 5 million population in 1979, and then in present day it's 15 million. So you're looking at quite a radical change over that period of time, and it's continuing to grow at that rate. So Guangzhou today is a city of innovation. Part of its growth has also come about through the Asian Olympic Games in 2010. So there's this kind of real idea of technology, growth, research, development, science. And this is a theme within this whole area. Like I said, it's trying to compete with the Silicon Valleys. This is essentially where the technology of the future is being developed. And that's the kind of ambition of where it's going. Strategically, Guangzhou is very much focusing its growth on attracting digital, students, people who are very much into data and understanding the future of our cities, and they're wanting to house them in the city. And we kind of started to see elements of this in the sites that we visited. Also, it's got the One Belt, One Road initiative. This is kind of revisiting what was an old trading kind of route through the whole of Asia and to Europe. It's kind of looking to reimagine that, looking through high-quality infrastructure, high-speed rail. And this is the kind of focus it wants to look at: growth through infrastructure and also growth through technology, science, and innovation and development. And that leads me to the 3 site visits. It gives you a bit of a context to the kind of evolution of Guangzhou. And importantly, each of these areas that we visited reflected directions in which the city is starting to go. You've got the first Konghua Hot Spring, which is leisure-based, tourist-based, trying to create a more health, well-being place for people to visit. You've got Guangzhou South Station, a high-speed rail intersection, supporting that kind of fast growth, creating more transit-oriented development in the actual city itself. And you've got the old town, that kind of challenge between historical preservation and the kind of burgeoning growth that the city's continually fighting for. So really interesting projects, all very unique and very different. Congo Hot Spring, actually first of all I just want to give you some of the locations. You can see here in terms of the whole Pearl River Delta metropolitan region where these three areas were located. So you've got the two major kind of city centre sites in the core, and then you've got Congo Hot Spring, which is about 80 kilometres north of the city. So this was a kind of, I guess, leisure retreat in the country, whereas the others were very much in the urban, either in the urban centre from its past, or actually the future centre. Congo Hot Spring town was north of Guangzhou. This was the site area that we were kind of tasked with looking at. It was, you can see there, got a rich environment, mountain ranges all within and around it, very traditional in terms of its setting. The mountains and the river are a huge asset for the area, but also got a lot of value for the Chinese culture. They see it as a hugely important part to the fabric of their towns and cities. Interestingly as well, and it was touched on before, that there's this regeneration process going through the centre. They looked at public realm upgrades. They do have a master plan, and this was a kind of evidence of the conflict between kind of trying to clean away some of its past without preserving some of its historical remnants. So its culture and its modernism was a bit of a challenge in terms of seeing how it could be, I guess, attracting tourism. So take, for example, here the grand entrance. It was grand, monumental, trying to reflect something that's past, but was still very kind of almost Disneyfication of what was its historical past. But equally on the other side of this facade was the kind of the veins, the heartbeat, the kind of energy of the place. As Colin was saying, it's a bit grungy, it's a bit dirty, but it's actually vibrant. And it was the cultural components of this that we start to see a clash. Modernisation and kind of prescription and lovely kind of designed facades were kind of forgetting the very nature and culture of this place. You can see here the river, an asset, and they were looking to maximise that asset. And there were some buildings that had been positioned historically on the river which were actually creating blockages. They weren't actually creating great frontage for people to kind of experience. They were actually creating visual and physical blocks, but they also were acknowledging that there were areas that they could contribute to. And this is the public realm upgrade. You could start to see quite manicured, clean, but not really used, vacant, empty. You start to see people, you might not be able to see it that clearly, but in that picture there, this was like a shaded area, and that was actually where everybody was hanging out. There was, so there was no thought of the kind of microclimate in this public realm. And so people were kind of adopting areas to hang out where there was tree coverage, which was quite an interesting trait that we saw throughout many of the sites. There's the hot spring, and this was seen as the big pull factor. This was the kind of focus of this centre, and it is an attraction across China. Hot springs are a real big attractor to get people there. But this was the focus. This is what the whole centre is driven around, one singular tourist attraction. And I think that is part of the problem, is there isn't enough offering or diversity to encourage people to there. It's very much focused on this asset. Lychee production in this region as well is huge. This is actually one of the biggest lychee productions in China. I think there's two provinces, and this is one. So this was part of the region, but yet it wasn't actually visible necessarily in the actual centre. So we were saying that other opportunities to start to bring this into the actual centre, allow this, some natural local economy to be kind of partly utilised in some of this regeneration. And we were looking at the kind of clash between the old values and the modern growth. Colin touched on it before, the fact that yes, it is a bit kind of run down, but actually this is where we saw this kind of fine grain soul of the place. We saw local communities. You can see in the bottom corner, me and Barry were kind of knocked on a door and wanted to say hello, and they were really happy and embracing to see us. But it was really evident to see that yes, it was small, but yes, they had a very tight-knit community, and it reminded me a bit of the slum dwellings, I guess, in the 1940s, 50s, and when we did the clearance and we kind of put people up in the towers. This is very much the kind of point in which China's going through, is This is seen as dirty and doesn't have the infrastructure and utilities to support prosperity and livability. But it actually has community, and the whole area is very much focused on people knowing the neighbours, living with each other, being very close. Yet the push is about relocating them to the kind of shiny towers and the buildings. And this was visible here, and this is a small provincial village on the edges, and it's kind of that on steroids in the actual city itself. And yes, we did workshops. We kind of talked a bit about what we think could be the direction in which the organisation can go through in the future, the master planning direction. And I touched on some of the points already. That was kind of our way of saying, look at diversifying this centre, look at also opportunities to kind of cater maybe for a rail infrastructure to access this area. At the moment, it's very much governed by roads. So you've got to get there by a car. They don't really support boat access because they see it as a pollutant to the river because of the very traditional means of transport. So from an accessibility perspective, it's very much governed around the car. Are there alternate methods to attract people? Could you start to look at diversifying recreational offering? Leisure is a huge growth factor now in China. They have more disposable cash. So the generation now that's growing up wants to start to do health, sport, recreation. Can this area with its natural environment start to support those type of uses, encouraging different demographics of people to be there? So there were some really interesting things, and I guess this is the challenge: is China's going at such a rapid growth of change that it's not necessarily thinking of the diversity at which we're lucky enough to kind of prospered from. We are learning from our mistakes. China's learning from its mistakes, but it's kind of still ploughing ahead. So it's an interesting challenge. The next site, very different. This is Guangzhou South Station, and it's located 17 kilometres from the city centre. And this was part of a high-speed rail interchange, as Paul was talking about. One of the largest in China, largest in 2010. Now it's one of the largest, top 3. Designed by Farrell's, and it's part of a bigger master plan. So this is a piece of a puzzle. But it's looking very much at transit-oriented development, looking at creating a community around it. But there were some evident challenges that are kind of going to cause problems to the implementation of this master plan, and I can touch on it as we go along. I've been fortunate to work in China for a couple of years, and I'm used to seeing massive stations there, and this is what you expect. It's almost like a spaceship has landed in a big area of land. It's gigantic, 7 stories high. It's got kind of viaducts coming in at all angles. It is huge. Scale there is just, it just makes the things that we're designing in the UK and Europe minuscule. And this was a really good experience for us all to see something on this nature. The third biggest in China, gives you a good kind of sense of the scale that they're operating on. Immediate thing that we kind of noticed was the fact that we were arriving on this ground level through taxis and buses, and the operation of the actual railway stations was sitting on the upper level. So there are the huge viaducts that were kind of cutting through the landscape and intersecting the station, which for a master plan of the future is going to be a real challenge. How do you integrate the urban development on the ground plane or the upper level with something that's sitting 4 or 5 stories up? So there were some real issues of transition between the levels that we were foreseeing, and I think that's again one of the challenges. Things are built and designed so fast that this level of integration is not necessarily considered at the beginning, and there's a bit of an example of that later on in the slides. High-speed rail. So this is actually where the high-speed rail's arriving, which is a real asset, but ironically it is 17 kilometres from the city centre. So arriving here really fast, you've still got to get to the city centre, which takes 17 kilometres in busy, congested traffic. So the pros and cons. We don't know the exact statistics, but again, location of high-speed rail is very important. And this, I guess, in some sense, yes, it's looking to the future, but even in its current state, the amount of traffic that's going to have to access this area is going to cause a problem. And it's also allowing people to use the car from here, which is, again, it's kind of not in balance, really. with such a big station, and we are talking like a huge scale, there's a real conflict in wayfinding. Navigating your way through these stations is a challenge. You can see there's about 30 signs in one area, and obviously we were English speaking, so we really struggled. Fortunately, we were with Chinese speakers, locals, who were able to direct us where to go. But this is the challenge you face as a local, but also as a tourist. You know, where do you go? How do you access the place? And then some interesting signage. I guess one of the things we've all experienced is the fact that signage translation doesn't necessarily relate, and I think that's a quite a nice perk of the visiting. Quite quite creates a bit of fun, but it is an interesting challenge. Again, it's like that kind of translation, and then we found that even with the work as well. Disjointed transport modes. So you found that the station had the taxi ranks and the buses at one side, not really designed enough to support the volume of people using it. And there was also these different levels, these areas where the traffic was cutting through the station at different points, car parking on the ground floor in the station. So it wasn't really an attractive area, and it was really confusing to know where to go and how these taxi ranks and these buses could actually support the population of people visiting. The aspiration of this interchange is 300,000 visitors a day. So to try and deal with that, the transport that's supporting this interchange isn't really working. But they are looking at opportunities to change that and look at retrofitting, I guess, ideas of taxi ranks and buses being kind of integrated within urban commercial developments. And that's kind of a way of trying to separate it, which was a discussion point for us, because with the actual interchange attracting so many cars and this area being regenerated as a broader master plan, how do you reconcile the traffic for an interchange in an urban development? And we were talking about are there opportunities to kind of separate it, or how do you deal with that? So 300,000 visitors a day, if even half of those getting cars and they're leaving, what does that leave the livability of that urban precinct? And this was a real conflict as we went through the discussion. And that this is what touches on local versus distributor. So this kind of master plan was designed around large-scale infrastructure supporting the entire station. So creating dense, livable public spaces and all that type of thing was in complete conflict with these highways that were just cutting through the whole of the master plan. And I think that's an area that we were looking at. Can we reduce the focus of these roads and start to re-emphasise that access point to certain positions around the site, and therefore allow better quality street environments, better quality public spaces. The other thing which was incredible was the build and rebuild side, and that was the idea that this large-scale public realm that you can see as a centre point, this grand gesture sweeping in to connect to the railway station, was getting designed so fast that when we visited it, we were kind of querying the access points to the public realm and where the metro stations were. And they realised that where they designed the access points and where the metro stations were getting built, they were getting different rates of this was coming before that, or that was before that. What became clear was the design for the public realm, which was costing £20 million, was incorrect. So they were looking to knock all that public realm down and redesign it to the new metro rail. And this was a great example of, one, the amount of money they have over there to spend, the investment, the growth, and the grandiose thinking of regeneration. That £20 million is a drop in the ocean, and they can knock it down and they'll start again. And that was, quite interesting for us as UK European designers to see something like that happen. But that is part of the challenge over there. And then obviously we then went through the workshops and went through those points and kind of highlighted the ideas of potentially investigating and improving the potential strategy of the future. And then the last site visit was the Old Town. So this was looking at historical preservation and also future growth. But this is an Old Town. This is one of the oldest areas of Guangzhou. So it has some really beautiful features, historical buildings, but equally it was sitting in a regeneration zone that was looking to populate hundreds of thousands of people. So this conflict of growth and historical preservation was a real theme within this concept. In terms of just general positioning, you've got the Pearl River located there, Geelong Village, which was kind of the starting point, and we walked along I'm not going to be able to say these words very well, but the Zhongku River along this corridor. This is a major road which has been, relatively recently designed, and there's a metro station here. And we carried on through, and this district was an industrial district, it's a community district, had some really nice features. The first of the area we visited was the Geelong Village, and this dated back to 1889. And it was called Geelong Village, which is translated as the Dragon Gathering, and that was because the first 3 men that visited there and set up the settlement, they dug the ground, and when they dug the ground, water rose and it was very red, and it reminded them of dragon's blood. And over time it changed to Dragon Gathering. But the essence of what this place was, which was a community enclave and village, is still there today. 100 people lived in it in 1889, 100 people still live in it now. So it's got this really nice kind of brickwork style and vernacular that's reflective of, a really important part of Guangzhou's past. Along the river, this kind of continued character still exists. Really beautiful kind of sweeping bends, old bridges dating back for hundreds of years, and a rich tree canopy. So there was this environmental corridor that was visibly there. And it was also intermingled with layers of its past: industry, local community housing. So you could see these visible traits of a place that for hundreds of years has kind of evolved and changed. There's just here's a couple of examples. So the traditional examples of some of the more recent regeneration, so in the 1940s and 50s, during the Mao period, very focused on community housing, self-build. So locals were given kind of opportunities to develop their own plots of land, and they tended to keep those plots of land within the family. So this is a very family-oriented area of Guangzhou. And yes, it's a bit haphazard. As Colin was talking, there's electric lines hanging out, and there's separation distances are very questionable. You've got balconies almost overlapping. But also it's got that grain that kind of reflects that close, compact community. And it was something that it was a really interesting aspect to experience, because we've been seeing the shiny new city for the last couple of days, and now you're in this dense urban fabric, which had a lot of character, albeit maybe not compliant to modern day standards. And industry as well, so from the kind of late 19th century, early 20th century industry, the diesel factories, and various kind of parts of Guangzhou's industrial past were still there. They were still physically there. And there was opportunities, they were looking at opportunities, and some of them already happened, to adaptively reuse these buildings into science and innovation, technology and fashion. So nice examples of adaptation, which we hadn't really seen before, and therefore that grain and that history is still visible. But that kind of opened up a few questions, and this area hasn't been regenerated yet. It's kind of earmarked for regeneration. And it allowed us to pose a couple of questions of what is the future aspiration of this area, and what is the kind of vision for retaining this historical fabric. And that was the first point at which we heard that that's a real challenge, because although historical preservation's got cultural merits, it doesn't necessarily have financial merits. And in an area which is driven by growth and modernisation, these old buildings that may be 2 stories are seen as kind of dilapidated and not functional to today's standards. Whereas I think, in European and UK culture, we're very much about how can we adapt and, reimagine those as part of the future fabric of a place. And the good thing is President Xi has shifted the focus of the country to be more about valuing that preservation. So Barry showed a few kind of crazy pictures of buildings and Eiffel Towers, and that's been deemed as weird architecture, and it's the end of the weird architecture period. We can't be going back to that past. So there is a real ambition now in actually looking at how can they preserve that past in a modern way. The challenge, though, will always come down to economics, and at the moment the economic model isn't really stacking up probably enough to justify it. But hopefully the ambition is this will be one of the first precincts that actually starts to do that, and that's what we were hearing. There's also the livable density versus the super block design. So I highlighted the community housing there and the kind of dense fabric and the 4-story housing, all kind of stacked up on top of each other. But the modern way of designing in China is super block design. So Barry showed some examples. Large, big kind of podiums sitting with towers on top is a traditional, well, not traditional method, a more recent method in how they're looking to support this growth. But it's evident through many examples of how that's impermeable, separating places, not necessarily animating, activating the ground plane as well, and it goes contrary to the grain of this district. And I think that's one of the challenges in creating that livable density. Can they start to break up the super block and make it into something that's far more permeable and porous for people to kind of walk through? And then there's the sponge spaces versus the hardscape. And sponge cities is a real movement in China in the last 5 years. The whole urbanization has created huge challenges of flooding. In 2013, 213 cities across the region were flooded. And Guangzhou is one of the key cities that's seen as an opportunity to test bed sponge city thinking. And that's looking at 70 to 80% of the actual landscape as an infiltration bed, an opportunity to absorb, recycle, clean. And this site provides the opportunity. You've got the riverscape, you've got the Pearl River next to it. And I think that there was talk about how they can soften the river edge. But there is still that challenge of hardscape. And I think the UK is equally challenged with that. The balance and reconciling kind of good, soft landscaping with hard is still a real problem. And I think it's going to be a continued challenge there. But the good thing is China is very ambitious, and when it sets its mind onto something, the whole country moves in that direction. And I think there is a good opportunity that this could be a sponge city district. And then that was it, really. We had lovely food and great discussion, and it was a really, I guess, interesting insight into a city that is one of the fastest growing cities in the world. And we were lucky to see video animations of this whole historical growth that I've kind of touched on. We, literally entire districts the size of, the whole of River Thames were getting developed in 5 years. It's just incredible. And I think, there's an opportunity for the Urban Design Group to continue this relationship with Guangzhou, with China, and start to assist it in that transition from being hugely focused on growth, but not necessarily considering the quality of delivery in the urban realm and urban design. And we can be an influencer in helping do that. And I think this was the start of hopefully many trips. Thank you.